Welcome, welcome everyone. Welcome. Look, we got folks that are on time. We got folks that are early. We're still 2 minutes before the actual session starts. And I'm really excited to see that folks are here early. That means we can get started on time, which I'm really excited about. Typically, in any meeting, I feel like I have to give it a couple minutes of a grace period. But since we already got some folks in the room, we're going to get started on time today. Welcome everyone. All right. So let me go ahead. I am going to share screen. All right, excited to connect with everyone today. Perfect. All right, let's give it one more minute. We'll see who else comes in and joins. But no matter what the number is, I'm sure we're going to have a really meaningful time together today. All right, and it's 5 after. We're going to go ahead and get started because the folks at Chesney, they are super punctual. They love promoting punctuality, and they've done such an amazing job pulling together this ERG summit here. And I want to make sure that I value you all's time, I respect you all's time, and that you're able to check out some of the other sessions as well. And so I hope you've been having a great time at the summit today. I'm really excited to get the opportunity to connect with you all and talk about a couple things that are really important to me, and hopefully things that are already important to you all or will become important to you all after the next 40 minutes or so. And so today we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about intersectionality and this thing called the Rich Dialogues framework. And I will get into an introduction of who I am in a bit. But first, I want to ground us in some intended outcomes of our session today. And so, intended outcomes to me are super important. It's something that I use to start every meeting, every workshop, every session, every engagement, right? And I think intended outcomes are important because they help bring forward the purpose of the time that we'll be spending together. And I think with them, we're able to get a sense of clarity around what we'll be able to accomplish within the time, and then also clarity around what we won't be able to accomplish in the time as well. And so the intended outcomes of this session, one, we're going to create a shared understanding of what intersectionality is, right? And so a lot of the content that I'll be sharing with you all focuses on exploring intersectionality. We're also going to look at the role intersectionality plays in ERGs. I know many of you are ERG leaders, you might be a DEI program manager, and you sit in many different roles, right, where ERGs are critical to the work that you do. And so I want to be able to talk about how intersectionality can have an impact on the ERGs. And then lastly, I'm also going to provide a framework that enables ERGs to bring intersectionality into their spaces. And so I will share that at the end of this session, it may feel incomplete, right? There may be a sense of closure that you don't yet feel, right? And it's because this is a really meaningful topic. And so I'm going to share some slightly underwhelming slides for you, but again, very meaningful topic. And I think I'll be able to speak to it in hopefully a meaningful way that resonates with you all as well. All right. And so with that, I'm going to go ahead and jump into this introduction, right? And so if you asked me who I am and how I identify, I tell you that I'm Nico. I'm Expel's Equity, Inclusion, and Diversity Program Manager, and I identify as a Black man, right? And these are the things that I myself have been conditioned to think about first when I think about my own identity. And for a long or for quite some time, these were the pieces of my identity that I navigated life through. I didn't really think about the other ways that I identify because of that conditioning that I mentioned, right? And so, again, this is what I default to if you ask me who I am and how I identify. Now, if you ask me on a deeper level, though, right? You get some of those same things, but you get a number of other things as well, right? And so you get that I'm Nico, Expels Equity, Inclusion, and Diversity Program Manager, and I identify as a Black, heterosexual, career changing, neurodivergent, middle class, vocational trained man, raised in PG County, Maryland, now living in Alexandria, Virginia, with my partner, our 2 Siamese cats, and our 1 pit bull, right? And I'm sure some of you all have seen this language from TikTok, but I think it's a really cool way to kind of introduce this topic of intersectionality, because it then gets us thinking about the other identities that we bring with us, right? And so I've probably said intersectionality about 20 times now. I'm going to say it 50 more times before this discussion is over. I promise you'll probably be tired of hearing me say it by the end of this 40 minutes. But since I'll be saying it a lot, I do want to create a shared definition around how we think about intersectionality, at least at Expel, and what the definition that I'll be using for today's context as well. And so the way we define intersectionality at Expel, we think about it as the interconnected nature of social identities, such as race, gender, sexuality, class, and others. And these are just some of the ways that we think about intersectionality. But the thing that I love about intersectionality itself is that it highlights this idea that our identities that we bring with us don't exist separately, right? But instead, they interact with each other, creating this really unique experience that shapes our perspectives and shapes the way that we navigate life. And so, again, for the purpose of today's discussion and for the things that I'll be talking about next, this is the shared definition that we kind of land on. All right. And so here are just a few examples of what intersectionality can look like and how identity can interact, right? And so when we look at intersectionality, we think about something where maybe, a Black queer woman's experiences can be shaped by the overlap of her race, gender, sexual orientation, and many other factors, right? Or maybe a transgender Indigenous woman can face some discrimination due to the identities that she carries with her. An elderly Black man might often experience health disparities influenced by their age, race, and gender, or maybe even an immigrant Muslim woman might encounter prejudice based off of, religion, gender, visible expression of faith. And so these are just a few examples, but when we think about intersectionality, it is a heavily nuanced topic, and there's so much that we wouldn't be able to cover within the 40 minutes. One of the other reasons I love intersectionality, though, is that, we often talk about our belief around DEI topics. And I think intersectionality allows us to challenge ourselves. And while the topic itself is kind of framed around this individual person's experience, right? Like these are individual people who are having these experiences that are shaped by these interactions of identity. There are significant impacts that intersectionality has on our companies as well. And I see we have some folks dropping things in the chat. I love that. If we have a little bit of time, I'm gonna go back through the chat, and I'll go ahead and read off some of those comments. Also, if you have any questions, I'll try to save some time at the end for Q&A. I can't promise it, but I'll also link some of my contact information so that we can talk about it a little bit more. All right. And so again, intersectionality, while it's framed around the individual person's experience, it does have significant impacts on companies as well. And I'm sure that many of you are interested in knowing what those impacts are, right? And so when we talk about intersectionality and its impacts, we really focus on the company culture. And there are a number of benefits to exploring intersectionality, but there are also a number of risks when we think about ignoring intersectionality as well. And so just starting out with some of those benefits, right? One, companies that explore intersectionality they can better understand these multifaceted experiences of their employees that have these multiple identities, right? And this can often lead to more effective communication, better collaboration, and many other things as well. Um, it also can have significant impacts on employee well-being, right? When we address intersectionality, we can think about new ways to support employees with multiple marginalized identities. And obviously, having a positive impact on employee well-being then leads to increased productivity as well. And then there's often, a lot of focus and discussion around innovation and creativity. And the way we like to think about it is that by embracing intersectionality at our company, we are then creating an environment where we can truly bring in diverse perspectives. And those diverse perspectives and those different ways of solving problems is what's going to lead to that innovation and that increased creativity. And so those are just some of the benefits, but there are many others. I do want to share some of the risks of ignoring intersectionality, though. One of the things that companies that don't consider intersectionality may experience is tokenization of employees, right? By focusing on maybe only one aspect of their specific identity. That can also lead to some misinformed decision making. Ignoring intersectionality, you might make decisions based off of assumptions, biases, or again, just kind of focusing on one aspect of a person's identity. And then lastly, it can also lead to some internal conflicts, some miscommunications across the org, but it can also happen within these marginalized communities, right? Because when you neglect intersectionality, it can create this environment where within our ERGs, people don't actually feel like they are represented, or they feel like they are being framed as a monolith, which is something that we know isn't true, right? And so again, those are just some of the benefits and risks. And I'm sure that there are many others that folks can probably think of. But I did want to put that out there just as we think about how this might tie in to a company. I then want to share some of the nuances around intersectionality, though, because while it is important to talk about, it's also important to understand that this is a really challenging discussion, right? And so when we think about the nuances of intersectionality, just as the benefits and the risks, there are many nuances, but there are three that I want to bring forward during the time that we have together. One of those is the historical roots of intersectionality. And so, it's beautiful to expand our understanding of diverse identities, right? But often at times when we expand that understanding, it can lead to learning new truths about some of the difficult ways that our identities have expanded. And in many cases, we learned that people didn't voluntarily choose to blend their cultures. And that can be a really tough thing to navigate around, but it's something to be mindful of when having conversations that explore intersectionality. We also want to think about privilege, right? And how intersectionality can impact privilege. Because we understand that you can experience privilege, but you can also be discriminated against as well. And so one of the examples, right, is that a white woman may experience privilege due to her race, but can also face discrimination based on her gender as well. And so again, it's one of those things where it can make the conversations a little bit more difficult, but it's always helpful to be mindful of it when going into these conversations, because then you're able to address it, right? And you're able to at least give it a name. You're able to say, oh yes, this tension was created because of the difficulty around navigating privilege within intersectionality. And then the last thing that we have here is the invisible intersections, right? And we understand that less visible and often overlooked identities can compound discrimination and marginalization in really subtle ways, but these ways do have a significant impact on the people who are experiencing those things, right? And so the more we expand our awareness, the more responsibility we have in shaping these communities, these workplaces, these ERGs that are inclusive and that are representative of those intersecting identities. And so, again, just wanted to talk about some of the nuances. I did mention earlier, though, that we'd also talk about the role intersectionality plays in ERGs. And so I do want to spend a little bit of time talking about that. And so, obviously, with all of the things that we've talked about, or all of the things that I've shared around intersectionality, it's no wonder that it plays a critical role in ERGs, right? But I want to go into some of the details around the role that it does play. And so, one, I think intersectionality allows us to address the unique experiences of employees with multiple identities. One of the things that I recall that we did at our company, our Black ERG, when when our company began expanding into the EMEA region, we knew that we wanted to get a better understanding of what blackness looked like in the areas that we were expanding into, right? And initially, the majority of our growth happened within the UK. And it just so happened that this aligned with UK Black History Month as well. And so we actually spent quite a bit of time learning more about UK Black history, about the erasure of it. And we even connected with those newly hired Black employees in the UK to learn more about their experiences as well. And I think, again, it creates that opportunity to learn about some really unique experiences that are happening within marginalized communities. The other thing that I love about intersectionality, it really promotes this idea of cross ERG collaboration. The one thing that I recall in regards to this is, so Expel, we have the Treehouse, which is our LGBTQIA plus ERG. And what they did for Pride this year, each week they partnered with a different ERG to have a rich dialogue that explored a topic that was focused on intersectionality, right? And so one of those topics was, I think it was ABE, appropriation within LGBTQIA plus spaces. And even just being able to bring the two groups together to facilitate such a meaningful dialogue had a significant impact on the sense of inclusion that people felt at our company. And then third, here we have intersectionality. It also increases cultural competence. Like, I think there's only but so much that you can learn about certain communities if you're not addressing them and learning about them in a way that explores how their specific identities interact, and exploring the sub communities within the communities that we have, right? And so when we look deeper through the lens of intersectionality, we're able to learn more about the communities. I'll also say, in being not only the EID program manager at Expel, but also one of our Black ERG leads, bringing intersectionality into our programming has created this huge learning experience for me, where I'm learning about a lot more than I would have had we just kind of focused on this US-centric view of what Blackness looks like. And so that's one of the other reasons that I love intersectionality. It's just had those personal connections to me. And then lastly here, it also promotes diverse leadership within ERGs. I think one of the things that ERGs can sometimes run into is we'll create these ERG leadership groups, but sometimes they don't feel reflective of the entire community, right? And it can be really difficult. And for people within that community, it can feel a little isolating if you don't see yourself in the leadership of a group that is supposed to effectively promote your identity and promote inclusion and representation of who you are, right? And so it creates this really difficult dynamic, but I do think that intersectionality allows us to be more inclusive in the way that we build our ERG leadership groups. And so I've spent a decent amount of time talking about intersectionality, right? And again, there are so many studies, there's so much research out there on this topic. I'm sure many of you have already looked into it, right? But I also want to create an opportunity to talk about how you can bring intersectionality into your ERGs and into your organizations, right? I don't want people leaving this discussion feeling like, oh yeah, we talked about this really cool thing, but I really don't know what to do next. And so now I'll go ahead and talk about the rich dialogue framework. And before I get into it, I do want to share that, again, at the close of this, there may be a sense of lack of closure, right? And that's okay. Like, I'm here to have these discussions with you. And again, this is such a broad topic that we wouldn't be able to fully cover it within the 40 minutes. What I am going to do, though, I'm going to drop a resource in the chat at the end of this discussion. That resource itself is going to have a rich dialogue sample and a rich dialogue template that kind of walks through what a rich dialogue at Expel looks like. And so even as I kind of talk about what a rich dialogue is, I'll talk about some of the best practices. It may feel a little difficult to conceptualize how all of this ties into each other, right? But I think once you take the stuff that I'll talk about and you take the resources that I'll share with you all, I think they'll work together to create a better understanding of how you can bring this framework into your organization. All right. And so with that, I'll go ahead and jump into it. So what is a rich dialogue? We've adopted rich dialogues from our DEI partner performance paradigm. They are an amazing organization. They put together some really cool human-centered leadership experiences. And in the resource that I'll share with you all later, I'll also have their contact information in it as well. I highly encourage you all to check them out. They take away so much of the lift of doing this work. And we all understand that doing this work, it takes a village. It takes, it takes all of us to be active and to create a real impact at our organizations, but also beyond. And so a rich dialogue itself is just a communication method that strengthens relationships by exploring variations and points of view around race, identity, culture, and heritage. And that's what RICH effectively stands for. And I want to talk about why I think this works, right? I think we often oppose embracing differences in perspectives because we tend to believe that differences drive us apart, right? But I think it's quite the contrary. I think differences actually bring us together just as much as our similarities do, right? And I think even the differences within our similarities and the similarities within our differences also work together to help us build really meaningful relationships with each other. And so I'm going to share two examples of how I think that shows up, right? All right, so one is, my personal life. When my partner and I, if we go out to dinner, right, there is only one rule about what I order, and it is that it cannot be the same thing that she orders, right? And that is extremely important to her because for her and for me, it feels like we are robbing ourselves of the experience if we're both ordering the same dish, right? Like, sure, we could order it, we could talk about it, we could talk about maybe the same things that we hate, the same things that we like, but it's not the same experience as us ordering different dishes, trying each other's, and then having a little bit more to talk about, right? And so I think that's one really trite way of how um, you know differences can bring us together and can create a stronger relationship. I often think about so me personally, I love to travel, right? But I also understand that there are people who don't love to travel as well. And I've had people tell me like, oh yeah, like they don't love to travel, like there's nothing I can really talk to them about. But that's not true. Like, if someone doesn't love to travel and you do, you can simply ask them, why don't you like to travel? Maybe it's because that person has a fear of planes. Maybe they hate being away from their animals, which I do personally, but I still love traveling. But still, it's an opportunity nonetheless to learn more about that person and to create a very strong and meaningful relationship and a high quality connection with that person. And so that's why I really appreciate rich dialogues, right? It leans into this idea that differences actually bring us closer. Um, and so I'll go ahead, move us forward. I know we have only a few minutes left. And so I want to talk a little bit about the pillars of a successful rich dialogue. And now I will say that unfortunately, two of the three pillars are things that we typically don't control on our own, right? But they are things that we can have an impact on. And so the first one here is psychological safety. Many people understand what psychological safety is and the importance of it in terms of being able to facilitate a rich dialogue is that, people have to have people have to be able to feel secure, and they have to be able to express themselves without this fear um, of negative consequences, right? Like when we're making fear-based decisions, or when we kind of, tap into our fight or flight responses, or even just our primitive natures, then we don't make the most sound decisions, or we may communicate things that we don't actually mean, right? And so if we can create psychological safety and we don't have to come from a place of fear, we can be intentional about the way that we communicate with each other in these meaningful conversations. One of the other pillars is, you have to have company values that promote vulnerability, promote trust. And your company has to promote those values, not only in the words that they say, but also in the behaviors that they carry out, right? So it has to be visible, but it also has to be demonstrated as well. I have to feel like we have the values and we live the values as well. And then I may come into the conversation with a stronger sense of vulnerability and trust, but without them, I certainly won't. And so those are two things that maybe we can't control on our own, but one thing that we can control is creating some discussion guidelines, right? And I love discussion guidelines. They provide a really good base level understanding of what respectful communication looks like. And I think that's really important in these discussions, because these discussions are so personal to us. They're quite literally about our personal identities. And so it is very easy for these discussions to invoke a lot of emotion, right? But having discussion guidelines is that thing that will make sure that we're able to communicate how we're feeling, again, in a respectful way. And so when I drop the template in the sample, it will also include Expel's discussion guidelines that we use for navigating rich dialogues. You can feel free to steal them if you want. You can repurpose them. You can do whatever it is that you want with them. But hopefully those discussion guidelines will be helpful to you. All right. And then lastly, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about rich dialogue best practices, right? And so these discussions, when we bring people into them, they can create a lot of anxieties within people. And there's no way that we can control that anxiety for others. There's no way we can remove that experience from others, right? But there are certain things that we can do to help settle some of those anxieties, right? And so first and foremost, I think, providing an agenda up front is super important. I think this helps people satisfy questions that they may be asking themselves, or maybe even doubts that they may have, and whether or not they're able to share perspective on the topic. You also want to check in with your people before the discussion. Before every rich dialogue, we create an open space for people to share how they're feeling. And I think this helps disarm the audience. It often creates that sense of trust and vulnerability that I mentioned at the very beginning, right? And so I think this is a great way to get people to open up, to get people to share the things that are going on. And then it's also just kind of helpful for you as an ERG leader, as a program manager, or as a facilitator of the discussion, to be mindful of the ways that people are showing up. Um, you also want to review those guidelines for discussion every single time. This is something that is super important to us, even if we know that it's the same people who were on the Rich Dialogue a week ago. We review them every time. And I think this helps create, again, just a shared understanding of what it means to respect people. And it grounds us in norms and, accepted behaviors. Additionally, you'll want to try to provide some background context on the topic. And again, this may feel a little abstract. I think once you get the template and you see how we do that, then I think it'll make a little bit more sense. We also love leveraging video content that already exists. And I think this does a great job of helping people think about their own perspectives, right? For me, like watching something or watching someone else talk about a conversation or talk about a topic that I'm then going to talk about, helps me develop some of my own perspectives or helps me think about it in maybe a way that I hadn't been thinking about it before. And so video content can be super helpful in those moments. You also want to begin the discussion with more general questions. We also call this out in the sample and in the template as well. And we also provide an example of what those templates can look, or what those general questions can look like. And then lastly, I think it's super important to close the discussion by prompting people to share what changes moving forward. And I think this is a really good way of making these discussions actionable, right? Like, what impact will the time that we have together have on our company, have on you as an individual, have on the way that you navigate life in general, right? And so again, these are just kind of some best practices around how to facilitate rich dialogues. What I'm now going to do, like I said, is just drop that sample in the chat there. And let me see. I want to make sure you all can see that. Can someone in the chat let me know if you can see the file that I just dropped? If not, then okay, you can't. All right. So what I may have to do is I may have to work with the Chesney folks to get that over to you all. But it is a critical piece of all of this. And so, okay, perfect. Toby says he'll send it. And so, great. All right, we have, I think, about 10 minutes left for questions, if I'm not mistaken. Toby, keep me honest. I'm happy to answer any questions in the Q&A section. I see that we don't have any right now, but if you want, drop them in the Q&A. If you've already dropped some in the chat, I'll try to go back, read, and see if there are any. Let me see. I'm not seeing any questions, but I do want to read off some of the comments because I really appreciate the perspectives that you all are sharing. And so David Lopez shared that think of it like this: if our identities are intersectional, the human experience is intersectional, business operations are intersectional, then the solutions to identify problems are intersectional. Nothing gets done in a silo. Absolutely. I love that. And then Jaleesa Dallas, and I hope I'm pronouncing everyone's names right. As the lead of our Black ERG, we partner often with other ERGs in our workforce, highlighting the rich experiences of Afro-Latinos during Hispanic Heritage Month. Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw is a powerhouse in this space of intersectionality, absolutely. In our Black ERG, we did the same thing for Hispanic Latinx Heritage Month as well. And it was a really meaningful conversation that we were able to lead. And Dion Fackler, our Pride ERG, brought me in during Disability Pride Month to talk about disability pride. During Brain Injury Awareness Month, my ERG worked with our military ERG. All of our ERGs are working on a parenting initiative to explore intersectionality as parents. I love that. I love that. And keep sharing these sentiments, right? Because these are things that other people may be able to take to their companies and repurpose as well. And I see Toby has a couple questions here in the chat. So let me go ahead and look at those. All right. How do you approach ERG programming from an intersectional lens? How do you think about which group owns a certain program? Yeah, I think that is a great question. Let me see. I think the next comment is actually a continuation of that. For example, a women's and Black ERG event hosted at the end of February to celebrate Black women. Who owns that, right? And I think so. It's a great question. I think there is no great answer or no one size fits all. I think it's on a case by case basis. I think so. What we tend to do is we try to bring our ERG leaders together to have these conversations, right? And we will, if a certain celebration, Heritage Month, or acknowledgement leans towards one identity more, right? And so, for example, Black History Month itself is encompassing of the entire Black community. That is something where our Black ERG would likely lean in and be the lead on that discussion, and they would partner with that women's ERG to assist with that conversation. But everyone has a, you know, everyone has an equal voice in participating in that conversation and crafting what that looks like. But again, the Black ERG itself would probably lead that initiative. Now, on the contrary, if that were to happen a few weeks later, when we were in Women's History Month, then that's something that likely the Women's ERG would lead and the Black ERG would partner with them on and kind of assist. And so it's really a judgment call, right? I think one, your ERG leaders have to be empathetic with one another, and they also have to be mindful of the time of year and the other things that the other ERGs have going on, right? And so if you know that your LGBTQIA plus ERG is doing a bunch of things for pride programming, and maybe one of those things isn't an intersectional conversation, but you do want to bring that into the fold, then take initiative and say, this is something where we'll go ahead and do the heavy lifting, because we know that you all are planning so much for the month, but we still find this experience very meaningful, and we still want to bring this to our people. And so again, no great answer. It varies on a case-by-case basis, but I think that there are things that you can use in times of the year that you can lean into to help kind of navigate or help direct who takes ownership of what. Great question, though. Thank you, Toby, for popping that in the chat. All right. Any other questions? I just want to make sure everyone gets the most out of the session today. I'll give it maybe 30 more seconds. I know when we're on webinars, it can be a little difficult to type the question up. Awesome. Well, I want to thank you all for showing up to the talk today. I also want to share, this is really meaningful because I'm going on a 1-month sabbatical, which I've gotten for being at Expel for over 5 years now. And this is the very last meeting or the very last engagement that I get to participate before that sabbatical. And so this was just absolutely the best way or the best send off for me. And so I would love to connect with you all. I think Toby went ahead and shared the contact information. Hopefully you all enjoy the rest of the summit. Reach out to me on LinkedIn, reach out to me via the contact information, and we can continue the discussion. Awesome. All right. Thank you, everyone. Take care.